Aló, ahí estamos. Muy buenos días y bienvenidos.
Good morning and welcome to the 19th version of Latam Focus. I would just like to mention that there are some empty seats up front. Today I would like to begin by recognizing Horst Bollmann. Many of us present here today at BTG worked closely with him, and we were privileged enough to accompany this fabulous businessman at BTG. We worked with Cencosud, aiding them in purchasing Almacenes París, and then with another acquisition in Colombia and other acquisitions, Capitales, etc. So we are very appreciative. He is quite a businessman, and I have always been quite impressed by his level of energy and determination to move forward. So this relationship dates back 20 years between BTG and Cencosud, and so we would like to send our warm greetings and condolences to the family and to Cencosud. Now, when we sat down to plan this event, this seminar, we were wondering what topics might be of interest to you, because that's the purpose of the event, to pique interest in you. And we thought about the geopolitical global situation, given the Trump context. Every day there's a new piece of news, and the situation is constantly scaling up, and we know that this may, and most likely will, affect global growth in Latin America and Chile. Trump's administration has been in place for 2 months only, and it seems much longer. The results have been quite surprising. Contrary to what was expected, we are facing a potential recession in the United States. The dollar has been weakened. Interest rates have dropped, ongoing constant inflation, and the situation, the scenario is entirely different what one expected for this new administration with regard to politics and the military situation. We are constantly observing certain developments. So there's a very interesting discussion underway with the Russians or with the Chinese. There has been this looking down on the European situation, and the geopolitical scenario is quite different from what we have been used to since the end of the Second World War. So to address these topics, we have invited the president of BTG Pactual, Andrés Esteves, to address this confusing global scenario. Now, there's a second topic that is as interesting locally, but related to the global situation, and that's economic growth and the fiscal scenario in Chile. To reflect upon this topic, we are also joined, as is common, by Minister Mario Marcel, and we have also organized a panel with presidents of political parties, Rodrigo Galilea, Guillermo Ramirez, Jimena Rincon, and Paulina Bodanovich. And this is an election year, and so I'm sure they have very important messages for all of us. Prior to giving the floor to Minister Marcel, I would just like to provide you with some inspiring words. Now, we think that following the foundational proposals, we know that economic growth is necessary for securing better standards of living for all of us. We believe what we need to do now is to reach agreements regarding next steps. In other words, moving towards action. It would seem as though most of the challenges are related to public security, safety, investments, which are sneaking away, and institutional renewal. With regard to economic activity, we know that this has an impact on household income as well as the public coffers. We know that the fiscal revenue has been deflated over times, and spending has grown, and fiscal revenue has grown very little. In fact, we have heard that the latest fiscal reform has led to less tax collection as expected. In any event, we have created a state, somewhat welfare state, helping out health, education, and a series of other benefits that does not have the necessary funding. This situation, if we continue down this path, will most likely worsen given the demographic scenario. We have seen that there has been a drop in the birth rate, and this could have an impact in the long term. Now, today, the fiscal deficit is funded primarily by capital equity markets, and if we were to see a deteriorated fiscal scenario, this would affect all of us. We would have higher interest rates. This would have an impact on the sovereign funds and clearly would affect growth. And this is the classic negative cycle leading to shocks. I'm sure the minister could provide us with a masterclass on this topic, but we know that there's certain consensus with regard to the need to modernize state and to tighten the fiscal spending, fiscal belt. This is challenging. We need to pull in our personal spending and prioritize different areas, perhaps. And we know that many of the countries in the region have also taken this route when they have faced a similar scenario. In the end, we believe that the state should not be a hurdle for national growth, but rather should be a modern state providing better services and benefits to our citizens and should be part of a society bringing about wealth. It should be competitive. And that is what I have to say regarding that matter. And finally, with regard to the political party panel, I just wanted to provide you with some food for thought. We know that politicians are there to move forward with meet citizens' demands. There have been several failures. It would be interesting to know what you think about that, if you agree with that, and if you do, what do you think can be done to revert that situation? We want to make sure that policy leads to governance, and what can we do to have our politics more organized. Now, these reflections are input for all of you this morning. And again, thank you for being here today at our seminar. And I would like to now give the floor to Minister Marcel.
Muy buenos días a todas y a todos. Muchas gracias a BTG Pactual.
Good morning. Thank you to BTG for the invitation to participate once more at this event. I will not be talking about fiscal matters, not because I want to evade them, but next week I will have a presentation that will only be about fiscal matters. So I would like to invite you to this event next week. In this presentation, what I would like to refer to is the beginning of 2025, economically speaking, and the main risk that we all see, and it has to do with the global situation, most specifically the trade war. So before I delve into this, I'd like to recall what we were talking about last year at this same time. Last year, we were wondering whether it was excessive to think that the economy hadn't dropped in 2024, that there was a slight growth, and that there was a lot to expect. We had the fiscal impact and several projects that had been approved at the time. And for 2024, there's a few that still have not come to fruition. Some have advanced, but in part we can assess how the economies evolve comparing to what you said or discussed the previous year. 2025 began with the closing of 2024. In 2024, the Chilean economy had a growth that exceeded the trend. It exceeded the projections made by the market a year prior, and it was very similar to what we saw in 2023. The central bank figures, the preliminary figures, because we still need to wait for the national accounts in March, on the 18th of March, it showed a 2.5% growth. And on the left, we have the comparison with the projections of 2023 to 2024. And on the right-hand side, we see what has happened with a series of other variables, not just economic growth, but also employment, salaries, expectations, imports, exports. And that is what we know so far. We will soon have more information to take a look at consumption, for example. So when we put this all into perspective, and looking at the levels of activity, we see that they have stabilized in around 3 months, and we see the path that we have followed, and the adjustment that was necessary between 2022 and 2023 was made. It was made with a relatively moderate adjustment, and since then we have resumed our growth trend, and it has accelerated in the last couple of months. So, closing of 2024 and 2025 has more positive figures. In Chile, we have this habit of intensely discussing the monthly data. It's important to mention that not many countries have monthly indicators, such as the IMASEC, which we have. The U.S. does not have an IMASEC. They only have quarterly numbers, and that is because monthly figures are subject to volatility, and that is reflected in this graph. Here we see that the solid bar is the IMASEC in blue, and in squares we have the seasonal factor. And the seasonal factors or transient variations they differ. So when you look at monthly figures, you need to be cautious and not overweight these data. You need to further understand them. And it's important to compare the evolution of these data with the IMASEC reference in Google. So the opinion traffic around IMASEC for each of these months. If you look at the red line, the peak was in September last year, when the IMASEC, the preliminary IMASEC, was zero growth. At the time, there were many statements. Many of you here were part of that debate and said zero growth. Well, that was 1 month where the seasonal factor was negative, and there were several holidays. And if you look at the contrast with 2024, when there was a surprise. It was pretty much the same, but in the opposite direction. In December 2024, we had 3 points above expectations. So September 2024, we had 3 points below. However, And the traffic of conversations in Google, we had one-fifth of what we saw in December when it was zero. So there is a certain bias in our public appreciation of these figures. So beyond any bias, we need to filter monthly data and analyze these data correctly. So December had a positive component. We had the production of cherries. Other months are more negative. We are expecting the climax of negative components that will be in February this year, because differently from when we do other compilations, maybe 0.5% in activity, in February we will have a full day. There's a day that doesn't exist, and that is 3% of the month. I believe the market is overestimating growth in February, because if we take into account that negative 3%, of course there's a difference, but when we discuss it, and perhaps we'll arrive at the same peaks of Google traffic, perhaps it'll be more than seasonal figures. So overall, it is transient. And if we analyze this throughout the year, if we look at working days and so on, we will have a better outlook than last year. So it's important to filter these data in order to include, for example, power outages. We measured the economic movement daily, and you see that on the day of the power outage, there is a drop, and it'll cost us 0.2 or 0.5% of the activity for that year. In terms of inflation, it's important to note that several years we had an inflation that was subsidized by the freezing of power tariffs or rates. And when you compare the total CPI with the CPI without power, you see the trajectory in the last few months. But this is a process that is concluded, and once the first raises in the power rates, the CPI are included, the CPI will start dropping and it'll adjust. On this slide, we see this growing trend of the power rates, and we see the sacrifices made during an election year. Updating the power rates was a challenge. It was easy to freeze them. It was very easy to accrue $5 billion debt with the power sector, and how difficult it was to adjust them. And it was done. Fortunately, it's behind us. We see the impact on the rates and the CPI. Now, with the drop of the inflation in August 2022 and the adjustments of the minimum wage, we have seen significant growth. There is a growth rate that is much faster than previous years. And in the labor market, after everything we discussed last year on informality, take a look at what happened in the year's balance. Formal employment grew and informal jobs decreased. It's not surprising that the informality rate has dropped by 26.3% in the last measurement. At its highest point, informality in Chile exceeded 30% of the labor force, the workforce, and now it's 0.23. This also has to do with the restructuring of the workforce because there is a fraction of those who were part of the workforce before the COVID crisis that has not returned. That is those over 60 and those under 24 years of age. And with all the time that has gone by, we can anticipate that this scenario, this pre-COVID scenario, will not return. Many of the youth under 24 that did not return have gone back to studying, and those over 60 are not returning either, because with the increase of the pension, they won't have the same incentive to return to the workforce. So we've heard this talk about informality, and there have been many changes in Chile in terms of the cost of education and pensions. This brings about a more structural change of the workforce, and those who left the workforce and have not returned were traditionally employing themselves in the formal sector, and that is why informality has dropped. So in terms of corporate expectations, we see an improvement. The first time we see positive figures in 3 years. And this movement, this positive or upward trend, is not only in mining, but also in trade. Construction continues to be our challenge. And somehow this is also reflected in the investment plans. The last latest figures of investment show us the 2024 to 2027 figures are around 7% increase, and this does not include some of the investment plans that we saw in the last semester. I recently visited Escondida, and as we know, BHP announced investments for over $11 billion for the next 8 years. Glencore announced something similar. And Los Bronces, Anglo-American, was not part of this, is also going to be included in the figures. And there is a significant increase in 2025 with respect to 2024.
And that's what we can see with regard to capital goods imports. So 2025, based on our expectations, will be a year in which we can recover investment, which hasn't dropped all that much, but we know that in order to have robust growth, it's important for investment to lead the way. Here we have mining sector data. Last year, there was growth towards the end of the year, significant increase with regard to mining production. Imports also grew, led by the mining sector, but accompanied as well by other sectors. And this has occurred despite the fact that the financial conditions were quite adverse. It's been 4 years now where we have faced restrictive financial conditions, and this has not occurred in any recent economic cycle. We have to go back to the 80s to find something similar. We did not see this situation during the Asian crisis, during the international crises. Now, we are pleased with regard to the situation during COVID-19 because thanks to several actions taken by the government back then and the central bank, we were able to maintain credit. In fact, it increased credit for SMEs, loans, and since then, the interest rates continue to be high, and loans and credits are quite restrictive. It's interesting to see that we were able to grow at roughly the average rate that we grew during several years prior to the pandemic, despite these restrictive financial conditions. Now, of course, this may loosen up, but that will depend on many conditions: the central bank, the international scenario, risk perception, etc. I still think, though, despite all that, we have significant challenges ahead. So, in short, in 2024, the economy behaved positively in keeping with what we at the Ministry of Finance had anticipated. As far as the macroeconomic scenario is concerned, we are not facing major hurdles with regard to boosting economic performance as compared to the previous year. We have launched 2025 with figures that are in keeping with those perspectives, with that situation, but the drivers of economic activity may be different, and we are underscoring the more relevant role of investment as a driver of economic growth going forward. It's also important to not overinterpret the monthly economic activity figures and other types of figures. When I was at the central bank, I said the same thing with regard to the CPI and midterm growth is open to, it's open. We'll see what happens there. Now, there's a lot that we can do to boost growth. Many of these initiatives are underway, and others are being discussed by Congress. So, in addition to all of this, we need to take full advantage of the opportunities as they present themselves and mitigate risk. Here we have a quick summary of the various measures announced, measures related to U.S. tariffs, as announced since the new administration took office. This graph needs to be changed every 6 hours. After 6 hours, it becomes obsolete. As we can see, there is a great deal of information on this slide. The announcements are made, adjustments are applied, replies come and go. And when you compare this information with the first Trump administration, you can see that we are again at a higher level of protectionism than we saw during the first administration. This index is based on tariff-related news in the international scenario. During the first Trump administration, global trade dropped. But trade between the U.S. and Chile was not very much affected. The primary tariffs were very specific to a small number of countries and products, primarily focused on China back then, and there was no lack of recognition of free trade agreements. We need to have a clear understanding that this is not just specifically related to the U.S. administration. Globalization has constantly been under discussion well beyond the U.S. context. In the past, I worked a great deal outside of Chile, and I would take part in the discussions related to whether or not globalization has brought benefits to the more advanced countries, to their workers, and this was an ongoing discussion. There was a great deal of talk about the difficulties related to reorganizing and rechanneling resources to the less competitive sectors. So there is a certain degree of sensitivity in the developed world than there is in the emerging countries world. In the developing countries world, we embrace globalization. In the advanced countries, they have also benefited, but I would have to say that the debate taking place there is more intense than the one in the developing nations. So protectionism is not just related to inflation. In fact, sorry, just related to this administration. In fact, we know that during the previous administration, there was some talk of protectionism type measures. So we need to have a clear idea. We need to understand that this is going to be a challenge today, going forward, and we need to steel ourselves against these daily news announcements. Now, when we talk about tariffs, what we first need to understand is that by definition, tariffs are a tax on sales. It's sales tax paid by importers. And adding to that, through this process, if there may be a goal to have an impact on a trade partner or to develop one's own domestic industry. But again, in the end, and then the first principle here is that tariffs are a sales tax placed on importers. Now, during Trump's first administration, that's what actually happened. When the tariffs increased, this tax was paid, was transferred primarily and directly to U.S. consumers. That is why we are not surprised by the fact that we have seen a great deal of activity in the U.S. Business community with regard to responding and stepping up and trying to have an impact with regard to these tariffs and the potential outcomes. We also need to understand where this protectionism approach is honing in. We have seen that the administration has honed in on certain countries, primarily China, Canada, Mexico. The focus is on countries with which the U.S. has a trade deficit. The focus is also on certain industries where the U.S. is a main competitor. In Chile, we do have an advantage, though, in that we don't have a commercial deficit with the U.S., so we are not in that group of countries that have a trade deficit with the U.S. Brazil is a lot larger than us. Their situation is different. Just a side note. As far as our imports are concerned, they're upstream in the value chain. With regard to agricultural products, we are in a different hemisphere. And then the Chilean investment base is quite diversified. China has always been in the U.S. zoom magnifying, and we see that there's it's place number it's quite high on the list of FDI. That is just to refer to the main aspects. Let's move further. Let's talk about what lies ahead, what challenges will we face. We need to clearly understand that there are three key channels through which the trade conflict may develop. We have the trade channel, of course. We see that there are challenges regarding tariffs, trade may be diverted, FDI may be diverted, and then we have the real channels that are related to how the trade changes will have an impact on the economy, on global demand for Chilean exports, real prices, and then the third channel is the financial channel, where essentially what happens is when you have greater levels of uncertainty, these have an impact on interest rates, on exchange rate parity, on monetary policy aspects. And these three channels exist, of course, but they run on a different schedule. The financial channel has a quick response time, much quicker than the other two channels, and we have already seen that today. We have seen how There are certain indications of economic crisis. This has an impact on the financial market, of course, on the stock markets. And then we have to wonder whether or not these indications of a financial crisis will be lasting or not. With regard to currencies, global currencies have depreciated with regard to the dollar. Since the Trump administration took office, DXY has depreciated, and in Chile, we have to face an additional effect. Our currency is reinforced, and because we see that there has been a rise in the price of copper. You can see the figures here. Let's drill down to a microeconomic level. It's important to differentiate between the volume of our exports to the U.S. and the different aspects that would most likely be affected in the event of a commercial distortion. Here we need to weigh the cost of rechanneling our trade activities elsewhere, the expected distortion, the probability given the tariffs. We have to take into consideration the importance and the size of the different industries affected and the complementary channels. For example, channels with regard to copper, we are seeing that obviously the price of copper has fluctuated on international markets over the last few days. Here we have a table that refers to the primary Chilean exports to the U.S. One can see the volume of the exports. One can also see the share of Chilean exports to the U.S. and the weighting of Chilean exports to the U.S. as a portion of our total exports. We can see that Chile supplies a substantial percentage of copper cathodes to the U.S. These Chilean exports correspond to 32% of Chile's total copper cathode exports. We can see salmon fillets, wood products, fresh cherries, grapes, etc. And the final column refers to the first or second country for our exports. This is important if we are going to have to reorganize the destination of our exports. This is more of a graphic representation of what I just explained. It helps us to specifically understand the combination of how much our exports weigh in the overall, our exports to the U.S., the weighting of that in our overall portfolio. And now with regard to copper, we are very important with regard to supplying the U.S., but the weighting of our products in the U.S. Is not as important for copper as other products are.
We see that there is a high proportion of exports or imports that are from the U.S., and some are a significant part of our exports going to the U.S. Then there are other situations, such as grapes and fresh cherries. Here we have the seasonal changes and citrus as well. This allows us to have a risk map, a map that allows us to identify where the risks and alternatives are for our trade strategy. In copper, we see an announcement or reference of copper as being subject to tariffs, and this investigation made by an executive order. The effect has been to increase the price of copper, but also to significantly increase the spread between the price you see in different markets. Why? Well, it happens because in view of possible tariff raises or the inclusion of tariffs on the price, or there are consumers that are seeking to anticipate their purchases and to stock up on copper. And we need to understand that importers of copper into the U.S. are mostly Canada, Mexico, and China. And if you read the executive order, what you see is that it's very much centered on copper smelters in China and the export to the U.S. So, at least for a while, we don't really know how long because it's quite volatile, but for some time we will have higher copper prices because there is a risk of additional tariffs to copper imported to the U.S. Interest rates, the highest transmission channel for bonds in the United States, have been rising, responding to higher premiums, risk premiums. And in the case of the monetary policy, they've mitigated and disappeared expectations of a low acceleration of interest rates. There is a certain weight, and these tariffs will affect the market, and then the Federal Reserve will most likely anticipate, but there's an anticipation of a slight decrease. So it really depends on how this situation develops in this period. And in terms of interest rates, today, on the side of the monetary policy and the inclusion of risk factors, longer rates are higher in the U.S., and these long rates also affect the bonds to 10 years. And in light blue, you have mortgage rates, which tend to be long rates, but with certain margins. I also mentioned the fact that Chile has a very diverse portfolio. The foreign direct investment flows, especially from Canada and Europe. And what we also find that's very interesting is that the export ranking of Chile is not that different from that of other countries importing into or exporting to Chile. So, as we know, in Chile, foreign investment is not negotiated as in other countries. Foreign investment arrives in Chile because we offer them predictable conditions, and that has brought us, even in difficult situations, it has brought us a high foreign investment, and it has continued to grow. 2023, 2024, we can see that they were significant foreign investment years. There's also feedback here because these are not companies that are arriving in Chile. They are companies that have that are already installed and operating in Chile, and they just continue to expand their investments. That is why we have such a diversified base. And through direct foreign investment, we are finding ways to supplement this. We see a relationship with the world that is very diversified. So here is where our strengths lie. Chile is a trustworthy trade partner that respects agreements, norms, and has developed the way in which it interacts with these markets. Basically, what that does is that our relationship with these countries that are making these decisions are not only through the official routes, the embassies, the foreign affairs offices, but they also do some direct trade. And this leads us to one last reflection, and it is that in today's situation, we must support each other in our strengths and take advantage of opportunities for collaboration, PPAs, that are very relevant in this context. These are times where we need to make use of all the mechanisms that we have in our relationships with the world, with other countries, and that are involved in this dynamic. We need to make use of all the channels to anticipate what is yet to come. So beyond elections that are coming up this year, this is the time for countries, political sectors, public sector, private sector, to act in a coordinated fashion with cooperation and showcasing Chile as a country that you can trust in. It's not an easy challenge on an election year, but for all those of you who are running, we have to say that given the timings of these things, whatever happens in terms of the real economy and whatever happens with trade flows and other global activities
En el periodo presidencial.
will be affected in the next period. So if we're not able today to show a united voice and to collaborate in addressing this situation, well, the costs will be paid in the future and could be very significant. On our side, on the government side, the Ministry of Finance, we are actively working on developing these strategies, on the message, and sharing and collaborating for Chile and its economy, and so that this economic growth that began in 2024 and that we wish to extend into 2025 and intensify significantly in the coming years can actually be a reality. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, ministro, por su interesante presentación.
Thank you, Minister, for your interesting presentation. Following with the seminar, and as I announced in the beginning, there are several people that wanted to come today to hear Estevez's comments within the Trump context. It's not easy, so I'd like to leave you with the president of BTG, Andrés Esteves.
Gracias, Juan Guillermo.
Thank you, Juan Guillermo, Minister Marcel. We're very pleased to be here once again at our Latam Focus event. I propose to change to Minister Marcel from our presentations. I'd like to talk about Chile And I proposed to him to talk about the world, but Minister Marcel didn't agree. So now I need to talk about the world. So with the objective of, we have so many uncertainties in this Trump context that I would like to reduce these uncertainties by speaking in English.
Certain comprehension of my Spanish. Entonces, I will try to be more clear about this very challenging scenario. Before we talk about global environment, I will join Juan Guillermo in saludo to Pullman family and our friends in Cencosud. Host was a good friend, and we had a very interesting story. I will tell a very simple story. A few years ago, I came to Chile, and we had an idea about a very good M&A transaction for Cencosud outside Chile. It was in a different country of Latin America. And it was a proposed merge to create a bigger operation in one of our countries here in Latam. And I came very energetic, and very optimistic about our idea, and had lunch with host, and proposed him this idea. And he looked at me more energetic than me, and more excited about the future of Cencosud, and said, Andrea, if we do this merge, I will reduce my stake in the company in this country, which is, of course, not a valid proposition. Well, okay. And I came back to BTG, and I was very frustrated because I found that our idea was quite good. And at that time, host had 83 years old, and so a few years ago. And I told my management committee partners, look, I was frustrated. We came with this very good idea. I had a nice lunch with host, and proposed that. But host with 83 years old managing a retail operation is not ideal. And then my partners looked at me, and I said, I need to complete the sentence. And I said, if it was an investment bank, it was okay, right? But a retail operation is always more difficult. Anyway, so it's
haber tenido su amistad y esta gran relación comercial que ha tenido BTG, Cencosud y la familia Pullman. Así que mis saludos para ellos. Y pensando en este difícil momento, en esta gran incertidumbre en este mundo, en este planeta, tenemos que pensar en distintas incertidumbres, distintos efectos de lo que se hace. Y por supuesto, en la región, en Estados Unidos, China, Europa, Latinoamérica, se vive de manera distinta. ¿Qué es lo que está impulsando los mercados mundiales? Bueno, es Estados Unidos y básicamente el presidente Trump. Hemos tenido...
I remember saying that was driving markets at that moment 3 or 4 years ago was China or was local markets. This time is not. This time is US and especially President Trump. What we are seeing is a big swing in the business model of US. As always, in big democracies, you don't have a clear consensus inside the government. You have more moderate people and more aggressive people trying to impose a more radical shift to US. And what kind of shift is this one? Which not necessarily we agree about, but some people think that about 100 years ago, or beginning of 20th century, US didn't have a local IRS. There was no income tax. It was a more primary economy, so a lot of imports, and most of the revenues come from tariffs, and with zero income tax. some people look at this moment and think that an adaptation of this model could be the ideal model. So tariffs, not only to regulate very specific sectors or situations, but more as a source of revenue in exchange of a lower local taxes. And these same people have a view that the trade deficit, when you have that, every time that you have a trade deficit, you are exporting growth to someone else. And these, you are exporting jobs to someone else and wealth to someone else. What is strange about this concept is U.S. has structural deficit since the early 70s. And since then, it was the most successful country by far. So I don't see where the reality matches with this view. But anyway, that's what this current group thinks. And especially this group is led by the president. So President Trump, since the first mandate, even though that we didn't see anything similar to this kind of volatility, since then, he had an obsession about this idea of tariffs. And we have two problems with this execution. On the first mandate, you had a lot of strong people, and of course, Trump was a newcomer to this position. And you have people like Gary Cohn, or Steve Mnuchin, or Mike Pompeo, all of them very serious, qualified people. And you have also a lot of qualified people there at this moment, like the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent. But at that time, these kind of people kind of convinced Trump of being more moderate. At this time, Trump is more familiar with the job, more secure about his views, and he thinks it's his chance of doing a big transformation and being advised by people that have also radical views, like eventually coming from our world, like Musk and others, which create this volatility that we are seeing. A lot of people in the markets have a view that exists a kind of Trump put. What do you mean by that? If markets move too much, Trump would set back and reduce a little bit the pace of transformation. It's not clear for me that this put exists, or it exists in the price that people think. Or in other words, I think that markets need to move much more than what they moved in order to make Trump and his close advisors to change their mind. And an example of that was the markets last Monday, or this Monday, right? Trump made an interview during the weekend saying that eventually some quick recession or market volatility was normal, and then markets reacted to that with a 4% drop in NASDAQ last Monday. Another phase of this change is not necessarily negative, it's positive, which is a more efficient state. And important to say, even for the long-term implications, that Trump brings to the table some hard truths, something that eventually you think, but it's not obvious to say, or not everybody has the courage to say. For example, why U.S. should be paying for European security? It's a good question, and the U.S. has been doing that for 70 years, while Germany decided to be fully dependent of Russian gas, shut down all their nukes, didn't build any LNG plant, and with this choice, feel comfortable being protected by U.S. But there is a cost for that, paid by U.S. So it's a good question. So why you should have TikTok in U.S., but you cannot have WhatsApp in China? It's a good question. The problem about these hard truths and about this new view of the world is not only the view, because as everything in life, it's a combination of a view, a strategy, and the execution of the view or the strategy. And in this case, I don't think the execution has been the smoothest possible way of doing that, to say the least, right? Of course, the volatility that was introduced in the system by this uncertainty of initially tariffs, then geopolitical change, has been huge and unexpected, to the level that people are starting to rethink their business plans, because it's impossible to do business plans without knowing what is your supply chain, who is your competitor, at what price you should compete. So huge uncertainty, a lot of announcements and canceling of announcements and big change, and especially the way that things are being done are creating, I think, important damage. And curiously enough, I would say important damage to U.S. I don't see U.S. moving to a better economic model. I think we are moving to a worse economic model. Soon we'll discuss the implications of that in the long term. In the short term, more volatility in the market. And I'll give you an interesting example. This year in Davos, which is a third week of January, there is something called the Davos Consensus, which is the common opinion at Davos. And it's very important, the Davos Consensus, because it's always wrong, right? So it's good to know what people are thinking and everybody agreeing about that, because you should do the opposite, right? And in Davos, every time that I talk to our American friends, they were ultra bullish. U.S. will be amazing. Stock markets will rally forever. The big techs in reality are cheap. Europe is smoked. China will disappear, and forget it's all about new U.S. Since then, the last 2 weeks, this week and last week combined, was the best 10 days of the euro-dollar performance since 2009. So euro, as you saw, was at 1.09 and started the year close to 1. So it was the best week of the euro since 2009, right? China rallied, China tech rallied 40% year to date. And you have a deep correction in U.S. Equity markets. Doesn't mean that the U.S. is not the best source of innovation globally, the most functional economy, and in a certain way, what has been called American exceptionalism is true. All of that is valid. But as we understand, and we understand quite well, especially in this region of the world, if you have bad management, consequences come. Exactly like our companies. Good management come good results. Bad management comes bad results. Takes time, but you can spoil even such a functional economy and society like U.S. But then part of this wrong perception of the Davos concept is that people were focused on good principles that Trump brought to the table, right? More government efficient, cost cutting. Let's try to create a limit on U.S. deficit. Let's deregulate the economy, animal spirits. All of this is valid and quite good, and is the roots of American success and eventually the roots of American exceptionalism. But markets were pricing that somehow. And even though that we still have these principles, all the craziness in practicing the new economic framework created uncertainty, and this uncertainty imposed a risk premium in the markets. The markets were pretty extended in terms of valuations, right? In all-time high, certainly kind of priced to perfection in U.S. And discounted everywhere else. So the amazing performance that we saw in Chilean markets or Brazil markets or Chinese markets or European markets, it's, of course, countries that are performing well, like Minister Marcel showed here, are delivering better results in the markets, but everybody else is benefiting from a spillover of U.S. In the last 3-4 years, U.S. worked, or U.S. capital markets worked as a kind of financial black hole, attracting money from everywhere. Many of you have U.S. tech stocks, some NVIDIA stock or some Apple stock, and the same thing in Brazil, in Australia, in South Africa, in Colombia. Because the success of U.S. was so good, was so big, so dramatic, that attracted global opportunities. When we created this emerging market term in the 90s, the concept was a little bit more uncertainty, a little bit more volatility, some lack of full comprehension, but very high returns. That was the definition of emerging markets. If you translate that to nowadays, probably you see that more in Silicon Valley than any of our countries, right? Where in the world you have a company that in less than 24 months created $2 trillion of financial wealth, like NVIDIA. And it's not paper wealth. The company will do $40 billion of EBITDA this year. Right? It's for real. Money is there. So it's a huge innovation, huge revolution with huge wealth creation. And this attracted capital from all over the world. When you add some uncertainty to this equation, part of this capital moves back, not necessarily our capital, but global investors that were a little bit, had forgotten emerging markets for a while, are coming back. Curious enough, Minister Marcel, in the last 90 days, we received more international investors visiting Brazil than in the last 5 years, in each 90 days periods of the last 5 years. Yes, the Capital Research was there, one of the largest long-only global asset managers with 3 global portfolio managers on big parts of the portfolios, to say just one example. So a little bit of this money moved back because uncertainty was included in this equation. And the uncertainty not come only with Trump, come also with other factors. You had an important event, which is the DeepSeek announcement that was known as a DeepSeek Day, right? Talking about Chinese AI potential, that made people think about, wow, it's so unclear, the future of AI. We just understand that has a huge revolution on how we will not only do business, but how we will live in 5 years, given all the revolution ahead of us in AI. And suddenly, people started also to consider that the business models of these big techs are not so clear. Eventually, they will be disrupted for someone else in China, or for someone else in US. And eventually, it's not so obvious that the incumbents will be the winners in 10 years' time, in 5 years' time. Maybe included on the top of the political risk of the model change, you also included some technological change, technological uncertainty. The combination of these 2 factors, given the fact that what had been driving US markets was basically tech or high growth stocks, a premium or a risk premium was included in the valuations, and that's why markets year to date corrected in US and performed in emerging markets and everywhere else. So it's a little bit of short-term comments, but what are the long-term consequences of this change in regime, or somehow changing regime in US? And I'm more concerned about that. are we close to the end of a multilateral world? It's a good question. The way that Trump moved on this Russia-Ukraine situation in a clear bypass of Europe, which is a historical ally of U.S., it's a statement about the end of the world from a geopolitical perspective that we have been navigating since the Second World War. You can, the moderate people inside the government talk about bilateralism is not a synonym of isolationism. And the multilateral entities were not that efficient. Why should we continue to be in an inefficient world? Eventually, there is a more efficient way of navigating. Maybe yes, maybe no, but certainly it's a very important change. Another important change is what are the consequences of these tariffs in global trade? And it's difficult to argue against globalization and the global benefits of that. It was clear, right? The Chinese Revolution, or the complete transformation of very poor countries to middle-class countries like Vietnam, or middle-class countries to high-income, high-middle-class countries like South Korea, or even us in Latin America, benefited from that. Of course, commerce has been benefiting human beings for 10,000 years. And if you reduce the flow of commerce, it will not be good. So that's a second consequence of that. And the third consequence of that is a geopolitical one. If we are moving out of a multilateral world, you have serious consequence. A very important one with important implications was the announcement of Germany last week from the new prime minister about the huge change in German economic approach, focus on defense and change in infrastructure of Europe. It's hard to argue that after Elon Musk threatened Poland to take out Starlink, that Europe will be dependent of Starlink. Soon there will be a Neurosat network of satellites covering Europe, independent of US. So this consequence will be with us. I don't see a reversal of that, and it's important for us to consider in our decision-making process this kind of different world. And finally, on the long-term consequence for US is the institutionalization of US. And sometimes we consider US as so successful that we think that institutionalization of US, better than Chile or Brazil, is based on their legal system. It's not. In reality, it's quite the opposite. Chile or Brazil, we protect more our institutionalization via our legal system. In US, institutionalization is protected by principles more than by legal framework. And if you change the principles, change in a much more important scale the level of institutionalization than countries like Brazil or Chile can promote. Even though that we have been more politically volatile, doesn't mean that the observed volatility is equal to the potential volatility. So I'm a little bit afraid of what can wait for us at this arena, right? When you see these announcements of meme coins, it's just too much different things. And I think it should also be part of our concerns for the next years. But changing the topic a little bit, what's happening in the rest of the world, Europe, China, or here in Latam? In Europe, it's probably people are not buying Teslas there anymore with the same taste of before. And clearly, they took the message that they should not trust in U.S. for their own defense. And huge consequence of that, we saw the first one in Germany last week, and we will continue to see announcements like that. We all consider Europe from a business opportunity as a dead story, right? It's fantastic to go there, have good wines, good restaurants, good museums, but in terms of innovation, economic activity, not a lot happening. But not necessarily currencies move for that. This difference of, or this concern regarding the dollar created some euro diversification and a new breath for the euro as a currency or as a reserve currency. So Europe, I don't see a lot happening. I don't think suddenly Europe became innovative, but probably it will change a lot, a big shake-up about Europe in terms of global markets. To be brief, in China, we discussed it here last year that a lot of factors in China changed to the negative side, right? It's no more super investments in infrastructure with a lot of productivity gains, no more internal migration from rural areas to urban areas, no more wild capitalism, no more labor force arbitrage, because blue-collar work in China makes more or less the same than a blue-collar worker in Mexico. But something also changed in China. And we see this year a much more market-driven government in China, to the moment that President Xi promoted 2 weeks ago a big business meeting with all the business leaders, including those from tech sector. So the combination of the DeepSeek Day, or the announcement about AI achievements, with President Xi receiving the key business leaders in a very constructive meeting, I could consider, or we should consider, as a signal that a more market-oriented or more market-friendly economy is back, or at least in some magnitude is back. So the same thing, economic data in China was not as bad as expected, was relatively okay. And to conclude about China, something that I said last year, which is the population shrink as another structural factor about problems in China, more to the middle, long term. If you go to ChatGPT and ask what is the population of China in 2100, it will say you 656 million people, which is probably wrong, but the direction is dramatically in terms of population shrink. It's dramatically. But if you look where we are going in AI, maybe what is a disadvantage of this world, of this moment, could be an advantage 20 years from now. Because AI will be a huge revolution. We are ahead of something like an industrial revolution that will happen not in 50 to 100 years, but will happen in 10 years. Ahead of us, we have the privilege and the challenge of being the generation that will face this transformation. And this transformation will mean that we don't need a lot of labor force for repetitive tasks, for simple tasks, and more for complex tasks. And eventually, a huge population that is an advantage today could be a disadvantage tomorrow. So to be seen, but it's an interesting topic about this potential disadvantage to China, which is an advantage of India right now, and eventually it can change in the next couple of decades. But to conclude here in Latin America, and there are a lot of anxiety about how we'll be achieved by tariffs on this April 2nd announcement, and President Trump mentioned copper and other products. I think we are less vulnerable to tariffs than Europe, China, Mexico, Canada. And not by coincidence that we were a little bit forgotten so far on this tariff war. Tariffs, it's an industrial products mechanism, which is not the case of Latin America. We are basically commodities exporter. Doesn't matter if you are in Colombia, Brazil, or Chile, we are commodities exporter. And when you impose tariffs in one commodity, the price tends to adjust in the global market. So in some of our countries, we have deficit to U.S., which is the case of Brazil, for example. It's not a surplus to U.S. So I don't see us being the target of that, or us not easily adapting to a tariff war. It's much more serious, the situation of Europe, because if U.S. retaliate China, China retaliate U.S., Europe will be the one that will really lose, which is a characteristic of trade wars. Country A attacks country B that retaliate back, but the really affected one is country C. And Europe is an exporter of industrial products, an importer of commodities, and has big surplus with both U.S. and to China. So it's no more the low-cost producer because someone else produce cars with more productivity. Vulnerable to tariffs because you can tarify luxury products as much as you want. And it's a real issue. I don't think this is the case of Latin America. We have a big commerce flow with China. China is also a relevant FDI investor in Latam. I was curious about the FDI graphic that Minister Marcel showed. It's by far, in the case of Brazil and Mexico, China became amazingly important in terms of FDI. It used to be Europe, then became, in the past decade, became China now. And the good news in Latam is that we do business with everybody. Basically, all of our countries, we do business with U.S., with Europe, with Middle East, and with China. So to conclude, the good news for us in Chile, Colombia, Brazil, is that our success or our future depends only on us. So we don't need to be dependent on anyone else. We continue to be dependent on moderate politics, common sense decisions, and good economic policy. And this is not ideological, right? You had some center-right governments in U.S., center-right, center-left governments in U.S., center-right governments in U.S., but what created this amazing success of the U.S. so far was exactly the common denominator of that, which is the political consensus around what is right, what is wrong on the basic terms. So, of course, each government should do its own program. There is some change, some priorities, and it's part of the democracy, very healthy. The alternative of power is very healthy. But I do see a stable Latin America, and especially depending only on us for our growth, success, and benefit of our societies. So, again, Juan Guilherme, Minister Marcel, thank you very much for all of you to come here. Okay, thank you.
Muy bien, muchas gracias, Andrés. A continuación.
Now, and this is the final portion of the seminar, I would like to invite Jimena Rincón, President of the Democratic Party, Guillermo Ramirez, President of the UDI, Rodrigo Galilea, President of Renovación Nacional, and Paulina Voldanovic, President of the Socialist Party. The moderator will be Matias del Rio. One by one. Please take your seats. Male, female, male, female.
La hora, vamos a mirar la hora. Todavía es buenos días, ¿cierto? Sí, todavía es buenos días. Buenos días, buenas tardes.
Good morning. How are you all doing? Good morning. Thank you for inviting us. We just heard some interesting comments by Andres and the minister about global markets and global trends. These are aspects that we read in the press every day. We're quite on the edge of our seats. There's a great deal of uncertainty. And I was actually invited by chance to clear out someone's bookshelves. And I was invited to peruse the books. And I recall choosing a book, and my wife said, "You already read this." And I said, "Well, I would like to have it on my bedside table." And the book was called "Why Do Nations Fail?" It's old. I'm sure most of us have read this, but anyhow, it was just interesting to see that it came back to me. And the author is a Nobel Prize winner because he hit the nail on the head. If what the minister and Andres mentioned, what they mentioned would be completely different if the playing field was flatter and better organized and better coiffed, I guess you could say. And if the countries had good institutional arrangements, if policies were to work better, businesses would probably work better as well, and that would lead to progress. So the essence of that book is how there are some countries that are poorer than others, and it talks a great deal about the border between the U.S. and Mexico. Same individuals, they live in different countries with different institutions, and that marks the difference. So you, four people, are here, and you are good representatives of individuals who design policies and who bring about better institutional arrangements. So let me ask you all, do you all agree that you have a certain degree of responsibility with regard to the design of good institutional arrangements and policies that lead to a level playing field? And do you also feel that there is awareness of the importance of your roles and the awareness of responsibilities that you hold?
¿A usted le gusta el fútbol, Paulina?
I know, Paulina, you like soccer. That's why I think you'll enjoy this level playing field analogy. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. First of all, let's talk about the playing field. I look out on the audience, and I would like to level the playing field in social aspects with regard to labor, insertion in the market, and have more women. Minister Marcel was referring to the post-pandemic period and how we have not seen the recovery of all of these sectors with regard to participation in the labor market. We see the older people and women and how difficult it is for people over 50 to find a job. Let's be realistic. People want to work. And women have a post-pandemic major issue with regard to finding work. We have not regained the previous position. And in high executive levels as well, I see very few women on boards, in management positions, in the public administration. There are very few of us as well. And I'm one of the newcomers Yes, but you can be reelected. Well, of course, yes. But the point is, there's a gap, and there are hurdles that we need to address, and there are structural aspects involved here. So when we talk about leveling the playing field, we also need to take ownership of what we do with regard to universal daycare or the care economy, and what this is something that's within all of our purviews. It's not policy or politics versus everyone else. Policies address social issues. That's the role of policies. And it's also important to identify what the problems are and how all together we can make progress. We are not separate. Policies and politics are not separate from the society. We're part of the team. And I think those of us who are present here today have realized recently, and fortunately, thanks to the Social Security reform, that we need to focus on the country's needs. And we have been able to find agreements for the betterment of the country as a whole. And it's important to recoup that ability to dialogue. I think we lost that for a while. And I know that this is an electoral year. It's going to be challenging, but we are all responsible for bringing about dialogue. That's right. We have this country project, this society project. We're all part of society, and you legitimately represent members of society. And so there is this temptation to say, let's not focus on the form, let's focus on the substance. But every time we do that, we realize that form is important. And if you have a problem with the form, you cannot address the substance. And in a year chock full of tension is a year in which we need to be aware of form and substance. So, Paulina, how do you really think we are going to be able to maintain this reasonable form to discuss the country project? I think form is key. But again, form is always somewhat tied to the willingness to solve problems. For example, if I'm convinced and we're all convinced that we have to address a certain problem and sit down and figure out how to do that, we will agree to the form. And if someone proposes something and everyone else thinks that systematically we should not have legislation to address that, well, that's another issue. But generally speaking, I think Chile has not addressed this polarization aspect quite well. And on a philosophical level, polarization leads to violence. And so all of us against any form of violence, we need to make an appeal to not polarize. And of course, there are some practical impacts related to polarization. For example, with regard to the pension system, pension reform, we had excessive polarization, those against the reform and those wanting to reach an agreement. This polarization led to discussions that were actually harmful for the country. Let me provide you with an example. I heard a great deal of individuals commenting on how we were legislating and there was a loan provided to the state that would never be returned. Yes, there was a debate there, and one of the individuals said that the reform includes as a component enshrined within a gift. And that's not a very responsible way to hold a public debate. Anyhow, some were saying the state will never give this back to you. But where did this come from? Chile has been meeting all of its obligations for 50 years. And what about FDI? What impact does it have for FDI to hear Chilean politicians say that Chile as a state does not meet its obligations? We hear that about Argentina a great deal, and is that good or bad for Argentina? In the end, when you have polarization, when what reigns is the political win of my remarks, that in the end can be harmful for the country. And I don't think it's a very patriotic perspective. What we would have to defend is maybe saying, okay, this reform is not going to work. But it's not positive to damage the national credibility with remarks like that, because that has an impact on FDI and on trust and confidence. Let me now say something with regard to your first question. The book that you found, the book entitled Why Nations Fail, 15 to 20 years ago, it was in vogue. And I was actually studying in the US at that point. And I took a course delivered by Ricardo Hausmann, a famous economist. It was likely that it was not inspired by the book. There were many courses. There was Why Are There Poor, Volatile, Unstable Economies? I thought that was interesting. The economist, world renowned, was giving the course, so I took the course, and I was quite surprised to see that because economic growth is so important, despite how important economic growth is, we have not focused on that question. We've not tried to answer that. That's interesting, right? And those of us who believe in the market economy, well, we also saw that from 1776, the richest country in the world, which was the UK, was 4 times more wealthy than the poorest country, which was in sub-Saharan Africa. That was in 1776. 250 years later, I don't have the current dates or figures that appear in the book, but the wealthiest country in the world was 231 times wealthier than the poorest country. And so how is that possible? And there are explanations, and that is because some countries were truly focused on growing and some countries were not focused on growing. And because this has a multiplier effect, there's a very easy formula that many of us know by heart. It's not precise, but if you take 70 and divide it by the growth rate, you will see how many years it will take you to double per capita income. When will the families receive twice as much income, basically, in real terms? If we grow at 4%, how long will it take us to double income? When you apply the formula, and what's interesting is that the difference between 2 and 4% is that when you reach year 35, and you grow at 4%, you will quadruple growth. Anyhow, you need to follow the formula, essentially. So there's a multiplier effect here on the total outcome. And that's why I think that with regard to our responsibility, we need to reach agreements to bring about growth. Right.
Con ustedes en varios debates la hay, pero ustedes sienten que en su entorno, donde ustedes tienen que desarrollar su labor, ¿hay conciencia plena de lo importante que es el crecimiento, por ejemplo? De que una cosa es tener un ego moderado y querer competir, porque es legítimo querer competir, todo político quiere estar en el poder, pero que hay límites también. ¿Hay conciencia de la importancia de la pega que hacen ustedes?
Bueno, primero agradecer el espacio.
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you for this opportunity. It comes at a time where we are suffering the loss of a man who rebelled against not doing things okay. He was very much about doing things. It was very important. And when I hear Minister Marcel saying, oh, the truth is that we are doing well and we're going to grow at 2%, so everything is going well, and the audience gives them a round of applause, I think we have a problem, because if that is being okay, we have not understood anything at all of what's happening to us as a country. And this happens to many of you here who have been in this comfort zone. Yeah, we're growing at 2% in a world that is quite comfortable. But we don't understand that, and using Guillermo's example, that this is not necessarily going to help us. It's only going to help us in the long term with a great impact to families that need this space to work and to offer things to their children. And they're not finding that with this government. There was criticism of the freezing of electricity. This government did the same thing. This administration repeated the mistake. And, they say, oh, there are some gaps that are not covered, Paulina said, and we are setting rules that only contribute to hindering women's progress. For example, universal health, because there is this constant attack by the government sectors to having this be part of transformations. So in this golden age of our country that we feel and should feel proud of, the drama, the main fear was uncertainty, the uncertainty we found ourselves and how we would move forward. Today, we also find this uncertainty, and this has to do with the comfort zone, with not understanding that this 2% is not a good number, and that insecurity is eating away at this possibility of having a desire to understand what happened, for example, yesterday in Graneros, a couple of days ago in Ñuñoa, what's happening in Chile. And we have this election year. So, careful, as he said, careful with the promises you make, careful with insecurity. So it scales up, but it doesn't have to do with this electoral year. It has to do with something that has happened in Chile that unfortunately we are not understanding the importance of reacting and getting out of our comfort zone and to challenge things, because if not, we won't be able to recover those golden years that made Chile great. Well, leaving a comfort zone is always a challenge, but also these attacks that you're faced. You've been on the phone, on WhatsApp, most likely, because what you need to do, if you're told that your candidate is in a free fall and your opposition or competitors, but there's this pulling of sides to be moderate. We saw yesterday, we heard someone being more moderate, and in the afternoon, your candidate talked about the death penalty. So, how do you manage this tug of war so that the urgent matters can be addressed? Security is essential, but it's not the only thing. That's different. So, how do you manage this? Because you manage parties. Yes, Rodrigo. Yes. Sorry, I can't really see with the light. Good morning, everyone. Good morning, Juan Guillermo, Andrés. I'm going to try to answer from your reference to that famous book. Why do countries fail? It's true. It's because they don't have validated institutions and that work and that have clear rules of the respect to laws, to authorities. These are necessary. Andres, in the last part of his talk in English, Portuguese, Spanish, I don't know what language he said it in, but I understood that he was talking about the importance of consensus. And that's true. Every government has its program. There's, different parties trying to push and pull, but there are basic principles that are shared and that have a lot to do with the fact that there are institutions. There's an institutionality that is validated. In Chile, we lost those consensus dramatically, I don't know what, 5 years ago? Because of a generation that came, and see how this dynamic repeats itself, this polarization that if we don't step out of, we won't move forward. So we had the Frente Amplio accusing the social democracy of being cowards, what was once known as the Concertación, because they did this or they did that, they didn't do this, they didn't do that, and this cowardliness. And the others didn't defend themselves, so they just won. And we ended up in this fatal unrest that has caused so much to the country. But nowadays, to not be so dramatic, let's look at things with a glass half full, not half empty. The Constitution, well, we have a Constitution. Like it, don't like it, whatever, it is what it is. And it was legitimized by 2 failed processes. So there it is. Today, we have another sector that loves to accuse their peers of being cowards. Why? Because they're trying to reach consensus and in public policies, and this is very important. If they impose themselves, we will again have serious issues tomorrow. Therefore, the challenge, Matias, is right, but you're making an analogy. I don't know if it's Spanish or English, but that Frente Amplio is similar to Republicans. Well, yes, it's the same. So I'm understanding you correctly. Well, everyone comes thinking that they're all the boldest, and I find that very interesting. This year, the candidate showed up with a gun, shooting. Another one couldn't, do less, so he came up with a rifle. But in the end, the candidate, these are dynamics. Right, but there was one offering a death penalty. Well, there are people that are in favor, some are against. But one is institutional and the other is not. Countries decide. There are countries that have death penalties, some that don't. We can talk about that another day, but here there's an issue of institutionality and a way of facing things that is key. And we need to have institutional quality. Therefore, and this has been said before, we need to make an effort in generating intelligent policies. It's not enough to be moderate and to have common sense. You need to offer answers. With Jimena, we actually visited Germany in 2024, and I'll conclude with this. We had the possibility of speaking to the strategist of Angela Merkel during all her years. And they said it's not enough to say, I am center, I am moderate. These are and could be virtues. But if you or the CDU in Germany don't offer certainty and an answer to migration, to how to fight organized crime, if you don't offer true specific measures for the economy to grow not 2 but 4% and generate an abysmal difference, people will think not about this policy but about hope in the more ultra groups, the populist groups that offer easy answers but do not come to positive results. But hope is put in the wrong people when this happens. So our obligation is, just as we, I believe, arrived to an extraordinary pensions reform, we should generate other measures that can offer us better results. You spoke of persons, the politicians. Well, for a few months I've had to talk to them, but there are 2 periods when the primaries come. You have certain names, and they say, let's not put the bull before the cart before the bull. But that is something you Paulina, you just said that we have people, we have projects, and the Socialist Party, and we've known this for 100 years with the leaders, with all the comings and goings, but there are people. So there is a debate amongst people of your sector. Yesterday, candidate Toa and candidate or pre-candidate or almost candidate Fraude that are saying they don't want to be partners of Maduro. Then don't support us later. But so where do you stand? And the question is Toa an outsider in the party at this point? Why is this definition taking so long? Institutionality is important, and the political project is important. When we're talking about what Rodrigo mentioned, and I think he threw the ball out into the corner, but I think that in the rights we have some political programs and some personal programs. I think Chile Vamos is serious. There's three parties, but we have Kaiser, Cast, Carter, others. They are people with ideas. So what is the political project that the right is offering, or the rights are offering today? Is it possible for them to agree? So it's not really about simply moving forward. We need to take a look at what the project is. We are working on this. We have 8 officialist parties. We have great differences amongst ourselves, and there's been a lot of work done. There are references, the diagnosis, and the perception that we had of other previous times and the work we did, but what has been done as well in terms of security, economic aspects, and the position of the undersecretary in terms of international treaties. So there has been an evolution. So these 8 parties, and if we add the Christian Democrats, it would be 9. We need to agree on what is truly essential. And this is what we've been working on. So we're going to primaries with everyone that is in this. It's not a grocery list. They are essential things. Democracy, the respect for human rights, condemning dictatorships anywhere. These are essential things that we need to do and agree on. The 6 political parties, some are not necessarily in agreement, but parties that are in agreement will work together. And so who do you go to primaries with? Well, we need to decide that. But how do we define first a name if we have no clarity amongst ourselves? You know, Sunday there are elections within the Socialist Party. Are you a candidate? We're all candidates. Sure. But some more than others? Are you going to re-election? Well, I'm not a head of campaign, but okay, so is Toa an outsider or not? Why is this definition taking so long? Why are you using these conflicts? Why are you qualifying the institutionality? It is strong, and the Central Committee has taken a position, and this position can be reviewed, but we will review it when we have our Central Committee in place, and we will define what's best for our party, and especially for Chile. There's no delays. All right, so I apologize. No, it is a serious effort. I have no doubt that it is serious and that there is time. But you know that the party internally, is there a sort of waiting for institutional calendars? Or is there anything else? Because we're talking about the guns, long weapons, short weapons. So, you know, we're going to perhaps see this later in the papers. But you did say that in the Socialist Party, well, there's clarity that at least, does it have clarity that it is what DOA represents, or is there a group that represents other aspects? And that's the definition.
Aquí
We have not described any candidacies or defined that because we are still working on that, and we will address that within the next few weeks. Now, obviously, I value Minister Doa's past and effort regarding security, but no one can say that there is a before and after with the arrival of Minister Doa and security. So there has been a collective effort by the government to have better standards, better laws, better resources. Minister Marcel left, but he said, he talked about three types of security: social, economic, and public security. And those are the issues that the government has worked on. Let's not talk about soccer anymore. Let's talk about cycling. You know, when you're in the lead of the pack, and you, Minister, have been really pedaling for a while, and you're probably tired. And if you look at who has been in the lead, you have been slowing down your pace. We know that this brings about incentives. So, what is your idea of strategy for electoral candidacy? Has there been any free fall? Could you talk about that? I think a free fall is too extreme. I wouldn't change my backing for any candidate. Mate is my candidate. That's where I stand. I think there's a great deal of discourse regarding willingness, and I'm an optimist because I think we have what it takes to bring Chile forward today. First, we have the votes. Broad sense. The opposition has the votes. What do you mean in the broad sense? Let's talk about the efforts behind rejection. And I say we have broad support because it's very simple. The situation in the country is not quite positive. Economically and security or safety-wise, things are not good. So the next government will have to make changes. So the next government needs to focus on topics that are not so sophisticated. As far as the sophisticated concepts, I could be in disagreement with certain people, but as far as public security and safety is concerned, we know that that is not a sophisticated issue. I actually have criticized the fact that in a government, in an administration where you don't have majority in the Congress, you need to focus on priorities. The government thought that pensions were priorities, so they tried to reach an agreement. The government's priority was the mining royalty, so they tried to reach an agreement. Minister Marcel knows that we are willing to do that, but he has never Bodanovich has never come to us to reach an agreement on long-term policies that we need to implement in Chile to grow at 4%. So often they say these are priorities, but we really don't think they are. There have been efforts to supplement what is not carried out in the public realm, doing this in the private realm. Actually, I will have to speak at ICARE, and ICARE carried out a very valuable exercise. Key economists, for example, Ignacio Briones, Oscar Landerreche, in other words, said, okay, we need to have a proposal to bring about agreed upon growth in Chile. And so there was a seminar, we looked at the proposals, we discussed the proposals, and some read the proposal and said, okay, what are the 13 things that Chile needs to do to grow? And you know what? I didn't go any further than the introduction and the prologue, because I think that is where the meat was. The prologue referred to what conditions were necessary, what enabling conditions were necessary. First, it said we needed to reach a broad consensus. This government has not tried to do that, because in a broken, fractured system, it's very difficult to reach a majority. And if you want to reach a majority, you need to reach agreements. And secondly, we also have to understand that there's no silver bullet here. There's no silver bullet for doing away with inequality in other aspects. And in order to pull Chile out of the quagmire, we will have to have different agreements to pull out the different body parts so that we can all walk forward. First, we need to stand up. I think the first problem we need to solve is political fragmentation in Chile. It's very important to reach an agreement as to how we can reform the political system so that we can reach easier agreements that are good for the country. We've talked about this, but it seems as though it's been relegated to a different plane, a third plane. Rodrigo talks about this, Jimena might go to the primary. So what's the limit? How long do we have to wait for the primary? Uh, how far are we how far are we going to take this? Are we going to have a primary with Jimena, without Jimena? Who's going to be invited the first round, second round? I already mentioned this to Paulina. Well, no, let's just talk about primaries. Who's going to the primary? You, the socialists.
Uno, me metes el dedo en la llaga cuando me toca este tema porque efectivamente hemos hablado mucho de reformas políticas y el gobierno ha sido.
The government has been quite fearful with regard to making profound change. Secondly, I think Paulina agrees. We've talked about the political reform at 20 seminars. There's a proposal. There are certain individuals in the government who oppose this, as well as the opposition. If we're not going to bring about this profound political reform, we all agree here, those here, then if we're not going to do that, let's at least reach an agreement on primaries. You talk about dignity, lack of dignity. And everyone who does things for Chile is not going to be humiliated. I don't care if the door is slammed into my face 10 times, but I will do what we need to do to grow, and I'm willing to humiliate myself 10 times. So you do not lose hope? No. Jimena, what about taking part in the primaries? Rodrigo can answer for you if you would like. I'm going to take 7 minutes off of the time. Haha. I think there are several aspects that need to be resolved in the political system. What I've said to the largest parties in this country is that they really need to reach agreements when it's convenient for them. And I think it's very difficult to speak because the two largest ones take the mandatory vote, but the government doesn't want the mandatory vote. So this is something we need to be transparent about. So there's not an agreement with regard to political reform. It's unacceptable. As far as, let's go beyond politics. If we don't address the three key challenges Chile faces, we will never get out of this quagmire. You said at the beginning that security, economic security is one of the issues. Citizen security or safety is another issue as well. And we need to understand that we need to have a serious state-level reform. State modernization is one of the key reforms we need. All of the issues we've been talking about over the last few days in terms of influence, trafficking, and other aspects are an issue. There are hearings that I have that exist because of certain individuals refusing to accept bribes for buildings, and these important individuals have already made their statements. So it's not about me processing something that I receive, a request, but it's about really having certain individuals cut the line and using methods that are not the right ones. So Chile needs to deal with this. This is part of the debate. That's right. The important things are key, but the small things we can't lose from sight either. But let's go back to the primaries. This weekend, the Democrats will be having a broad consensus discussion where we will be talking about the parliament, the primaries, the presidential elections, parliamentary aspects, but none of this really matters if those who are going to be leading the country do not reach an agreement with regard to the staples. It's not about the death penalty. For example, it's about whether or not the Socialist Party supports the army at border controls, for example. This has been approved by the Constitutional Committee, but this was never rolled out. So I am not afraid of competition at the primaries. Extremes are not part of our approach. We do not believe in extremism. Caste Boric extremism is not good for the country. What about your sanitary line? Do you think it's possible to have a primary with Evelyn Matei and Carter or any other candidate willing to participate? Without caste, it doesn't seem like it would receive a lot of support. Former Minister Varela referred to that. Primaries are tools, and one uses tools or is engaged in a mechanism when the tools will be useful for something. I think Paulina said that primaries have to have content and some sort of schedule to follow. Otherwise, what are we talking about? You could go to the primary and have any result, arbitrary result, but that wouldn't make any sense. So I'm going to interpret all of Chile Vamos and say that this is only done if it really makes sense. And one of the purposes is to not have the first presidential election round to discuss what was discussed in the primaries again. We will continue to focus on the country's majority project to represent socially a large majority. Jimena and I have talked about this 1,000 times. The majority projects have antonyms. They are about identity, and this might sound very theoretical, but it's very important. The identity projects should not govern a country. Countries that progress are countries that are able to reach bare minimum social consensus about certain aspects and problems that the citizens truly face. And that is what Renovación Nacional, Chile Vamos, etc. are trying to do. And then maybe the Socialist Party as well, from its own perspective, is also trying to do the same. And this is key. We cannot make a mistake here. There needs to be a paradigm shift in Chile to really resolve what affects us most. For example, as Jimena said, state reform is critical. One, because it's not working well, and two, because the state is leveraged to create hurdles at times. And when everything is all mucked up, I always think that corruption finds that as an open door. When the entrepreneurs keep coming up against so many different walls, essentially they go to the back door or to the base, they enter through the basement, and that happens. And that's something that we need to face and be honest about and change. I don't, yeah.
Guillermo Ramírez y Eduardo Frei.
Just to paraphrase Frei Montalva, what are the limits? Because, of course, we need to talk about smaller things, things that have expiration dates. A primary, for example, election is important. What is the limit? How do we keep waiting for these tools? Well, everything shows that with all these parties, with certain people, there won't be primary elections, and they have said it. there doesn't seem to be an intention to generate consensus. So you would discard it? Actually, I don't know. So what is Plan B? We can talk here with my friend. There could be other people interested. Oh, you have the microphone. You know, I don't, I'm concerned. This is not a matter of people. This is a matter of a project. And when people ask me, what is the primary that you would like to be a part of? But what are the positions? That is why I mentioned the drama that we're facing. But what would have happened if Cast would have won? Then the constitution would have been approved, and the country rejected it by 63%. It didn't win, thank goodness. We had no idea what was going to happen with the country. So we don't want a country that is managed by the extreme right or extreme left because they follow an identity. And when you participate in a primary, so this is Jimena Rincon. Well, unless there are other Democrats, there are several. It's not personal, this question. If we reach a scenario, a possible scenario, there's many, where Evelyn Matei, Carolina Toa, in a second round, they're, you've been politically, had a relationship with Carolina Toa. How close are they? Because if Toa is second round, it's because she won a primary and because she wins over an extreme left. I cannot support a person that was a spokesperson of the constitutional text that ended the police and a series of other things. I cannot. When Carolina Toa says she defends the security, she wasn't. She was a spokesperson for the constitutional text that was going to end with our police. Right, but she has also done a series of other positive things. Right, 70% of the laws are parliamentary motions and other previous presidential motions, but we have done this from the opposition. There was no alternative. So you don't think Toa had a conviction? No, I do not believe in a person that defended a text where security was not important. You don't believe in an evolution of the ministry? No. No. No, because no. Well, candidate Matei has also had an evolution, but not in security. She's had a single line. Is that all that matters? No, but it's one of the things that matter. And believe me, I've had very different positions with Evelyn Matei in several things. She was a Minister of Labor when we talked about this. Do you have any limits in politics, Paulina? Well, I think that what you're saying is not right. It's not recognizing that what a government does or says, and it is co-legislating. But there's an anti-terrorist law, for example, that was brought about from a project of mine, and I sponsored it together with Macaya and other senators of Sandon. So I'm talking about public security. I've talked about 70%. And it's important to recognize the things that are done in the country. A government that arrives, can't come about and say everything was wrong. Everything that was previously done is wrong. So with a year of diagnosis, the first year, the second year start working, third year is you can see more progress. We need policies of state policies, and like Mario Marcel said,
Hace horas, dijo él riéndose. Es cierto, cada tuit de Trump
the statements by Trump make the markets move. So we need to have clearer vision and not be caught up in smaller things.
Y ponerme de acuerdo. E igual que el Guille, me pongo colorado una vez. ¿Ah? Y lo hago, porque lo hago con la convicción de que el país necesita.
I'm doing this with conviction that the country needs certain things. In fact, Senator Volanovich was the first to have some self-criticism and think that it wasn't tough enough. Well, yes, and I was attacked for it, yes, because we were not able, from the center left, to say that there are many things. When we recovered the country, it was a poor country. There was a lot of poverty, and we had to go and do things together. So I am not embarrassed of being young at some point. And in terms of modernization, with the ANEF, we have sat down many times and talked. They're not all lazy or thieves. We need to be at the service of the country. I am a public servant. So I fully agree, and I agree that we should all work together in having fast tracks. With the collapse of the system, there's certain things that have been the result of other actions. And I'm a lawyer. This is the lawyer's paradise, because things get trapped in all sorts of motions. We're going to conclude. We're going to balance this out. I'd like to thank Jimena, Rodrigo, everyone, and you and BTG for inviting us to this conversation. Thank you very much. Good afternoon.
Bueno, muchas gracias a todos. Hasta la próxima y será hasta el próximo año. Muy buenos días.
Thank you very much. See you next time.